The famine that drove Naomi and her family to leave Bethlehem wasn't just a food shortage. It was a starting point for a story of transformation that would span generations and forever change the destiny of a people. Have you ever found yourself in a moment of loss, where it seemed God's promises were far away? The story of Ruth and Naomi reveals how, even in the most desolate situations, faithfulness and courage can open doors to an unexpected divine redemption. It's not just an ancient story, but a profound lesson in how moments of crisis can be the most fertile for God's plan in our lives. Do you want to understand how a Moabite woman's faithfulness became a milestone in David's lineage? How can obedience, even in times of uncertainty, bear fruit of restoration and blessing? If you've ever faced difficult times or questioned God's ways in your life, now is the perfect time to delve deeper into this inspiring account. Discover what the story of Ruth and Boaz has to teach you about faith, hope, and divine rescue. Don't miss a chance to connect with this story, which, though ancient, is timeless and full of lessons for you. Keep reading and discover how faithfulness in the divine plan can transform even the most difficult moments into a new opportunity for redemption. The story of Ruth unfolds during a turbulent period in Israel's history, known as the period of the Judges. During this time, Israel lived in a kind of anarchy, without a king to guide the people. Disobedience and a lack of spiritual direction were evident, and people acted according to their own judgment. This chaos is reflected in the experiences of families and individuals facing the instability of the time. When we think about fidelity and loyalty, it is important to understand the cultural context in which these virtues were so necessary for people of Israel, who found themselves constantly at the mercy of the consequences of their choices. In Bethlehem, a city known as the House of Bread, the land was gripped by a severe famine. Food shortages forced many families to face daily challenges, and survival became a struggle. Hunger was not uncommon, but accounts from this time reveal the struggles of many families who, faced with scarcity, had to make difficult decisions to secure a future. In this context, Naomi's family found themselves forced to leave their homeland, a decision that would forever change their fortunes. The culture of Israel, with its traditions and customs, was deeply rooted in the concept of family and inheritance. Families were seen as fundamental units of society, and the continuity of lineage and the preservation of inheritance were sacred responsibilities. When Naomi and her family moved to Moab, they were breaking with this culture and everything they knew. However, it was in this context of loss and tragedy that God would begin to weave his plan of redemption and restoration, demonstrating that even in the most difficult situations, hope could still be found. And it was precisely this reality of famine, family tragedy, and the search for sustenance that shaped Naomi and Ruth's journey. In Israelite culture, the concept of redeeming one's inheritance and ensuring the continuity of a deceased person's lineage, known as the role of the Goel, or Redeemer, was crucial. This was more than a simple transaction. It was about ensuring the integrity and dignity of the family. When Ruth committed herself to Naomi, she was not only embracing a woman in despair, but also, in a silent way, making a commitment to the divine plan that would unfold as the story progressed. Elimelech and Naomi's decision to leave Bethlehem was not taken lightly. The famine ravaging the region forced his family to seek refuge in Moab, a foreign land and enemy of Israel. The idea of leaving the House of Bread to find sustenance in another nation likely resented many, especially in a culture so deeply rooted in loyalty to land and family. But in the face of adversity, survival prevailed. Naomi and Elimelech, with 2 young children, held a faint hope that relocation was the only way out of the chaos they were living in. Upon arriving in Moab, Naomi's family settled, and over time her sons Mahlon and Chilion married Moabite women Orpah and Ruth. The union between the Moabites and the Israelites was somewhat uncomfortable for the Jews, as relations between the 2 nations were tense. However, Mahlon and Chilion's choices reflect the difficulties of living in a context of scarcity, where options were limited. Their marriage to the Moabite women, while culturally complex, also represents a time of adaptation and pursuit of new opportunities. But the fate of Naomi's family was about to become even more tragic. Elimelech died in Moab, leaving Naomi a widow. What seemed like a personal tragedy would deepen when, shortly thereafter, her sons also died, leaving no heirs. Naomi's loneliness in a foreign land, without a husband or children, was unthinkable at the time. The loss was not only emotional, but also represented the loss of inheritance, family continuity, and even social dignity. The childless widow was in a position of extreme vulnerability. Naomi, now a widow and without the protection of her children, found herself on the margins of Moabite society. What was supposed to be a refuge became a place of profound suffering. The lack of direct descendants left the woman helpless, with no guarantee that her inheritance would be preserved. This reminds us of the importance of a divine plan that often only begins to reveal itself when the pain seems unbearable. The Lord, who is a Redeemer, was about to enter the story, bringing with him the promise of redemption for Naomi and her family. After the devastating losses she had endured, Naomi heard back that the famine in Bethlehem had finally ended. With no reason to remain in Moab, and with a heavy heart from the loss of everything she loved, she decided to return to her homeland. Her connection to Bethlehem, to her roots, and to the promise of a new chance was strong. Naomi, like many people facing difficult times, was searching for something that could give new meaning to her life, a form of restoration, even if still uncertain. She knew that returning to Bethlehem could be a way to start over, to regain her lost dignity. The two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, initially accompanied Naomi in her decision, sharing the hope that Bethlehem offered a better future. But Naomi, with the wisdom of experience, urged them both to return to their families, seeking a safer life with more marriage possibilities. Orpah, after a moment of reflection, followed Naomi's advice and returned to her Moabite family, perhaps choosing the safer path. However, Ruth made a very different choice, and her decision changed the course of history. In an act of loyalty and fidelity, Ruth clung to Naomi and spoke words that would echo for generations where you go. I will go where you dwell. I will dwell. Ruth's action was not only a demonstration of affection for Naomi, but also a profound expression of her faith and loyalty to the God of Israel. By refusing to return to her family in Moab, Ruth was not only committed herself to her mother-in-law, but also to the culture and faith of Israel. At a crucial moment, she chose to walk an unfamiliar path, based on trust and love, but also on hope and the belief that, even without fully understanding the future, God had a plan for her. This kind of faithfulness, however seemingly irrational, is precisely what drives the stories of redemption and restoration in the Bible. As she herself affirmed, her destiny was now tied to Naomi and the God of Israel. Ruth knew the future would not be easy, that she would face challenges in a foreign land, but the strength of her decision lay in her commitment to loyalty. She chose not the path of comfort, but that of fidelity. Ruth's story, then, begins to stand out among the many of her time, for it is not just about a woman trying to survive, but about a woman who decided to trust a God who, deep down, was preparing her to be part of a greater divine plan. She didn't know it, but by making this decision, she was about to be part of something that would change not only her life, but the history of Israel. Upon arriving in Bethlehem, Naomi and Ruth found a town abuzz with their arrival. News that Naomi had returned after so many years spread quickly. Could this be Naomi? The townspeople wondered, while Naomi responded with a look of sadness, "Do not call me Naomi, meaning sweet. Call me Mara, bitter, for the Lord has made me bitter." The pain she carried was visible, but also the weight of loss, hunger, and emptiness. Yet, despite everything, Ruth's arrival would have indicated that Destinies still had something to offer this family marked by tragedy. The town was about to see how a simple choice of faithfulness could rewrite the pages of history. The timing of her arrival could not have been more symbolic. The barley harvest was beginning, indicating the possibility of provision for those willing to work. Ruth, being a foreign widow with no social status, likely knew her only chance of obtaining food was by going to fields and gleaning the scraps left by the workers. And that's exactly what she did. She went to the fields of Boaz, a man of good standing and a distant relative of Elimelech, Naomi's late husband. She was not only seeking food, but also taking courage, willing to face any obstacle to ensure her survival. Boaz, upon seeing Ruth working in the fields, was touched by her dedication and humility. He noticed that, despite being a stranger, Ruth was there with a tireless spirit, tracking down the remaining barley, which was hard and humbling work. Demonstrating rare kindness, Boaz approached Ruth and greeted her, offering her protection and food. This gesture of kindness reflected not only his personal generosity, but also Boaz's cultural commitment to justice and caring for the most vulnerable. He knew that, in the barley field, an unprotected widow could easily be exploited, so he ensured she was treated with respect and dignity. Boaz's behavior toward Ruth was a clear example of what it meant to be a Goel, the family's redeemer. As a relative of Elimelech, Boaz was in a position to eventually play a vital role in redeeming the family inheritance. This redemption was not limited to land alone, but also involved restoring the dignity of Naomi and Ruth, ensuring that Elimelech's lineage would be preserved. Boaz's generosity, his protection of Ruth, and his attention to her needs began to emerge as key pieces of the divine plan, which seemed to unfold silently in the barley field, where, amid grains and promises, Israel's future was being written. With Boaz's kindness to Ruth, Naomi saw, for the first time in a long time, a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness of loss and pain. She realized that he was not only a man of character, but also a close relative, which meant he could be the Goel who would redeem Elimelech's inheritance and, consequently, restore her family's dignity. Naomi, always wise and observant, understood that Boaz's favor to Ruth was more than mere charity. It was a real chance for redemption. And it was with this insight that she began to devise a strategy to ensure Boaz fulfilled the role of redeemer, which, in practice, meant he would need to marry Ruth to preserve the lineage of Elimelech and Mahlon. Naomi, aware of the tradition and customs of Israel, which required a redeemer to be someone close to the family, began to devise a bold plan. Custom dictated that a widowed woman could ask a close relative to serve as Goel. She instructed Ruth to present herself strategically, as was the custom of the time. Ruth was to go to the field where Boaz would be, wait for him to finish his work, and then approach him at night during his rest and ask for his protection as a redeemer. It was a bold gesture, but also loaded with symbolism and faith. Naomi knew that the family's future depended on this action, but she trusted that God was guiding the process. Ruth, in turn, followed Naomi's plan with complete trust, without hesitation for a moment. She knew that the future of her own life, and Naomi's, was tied to this choice. Upon reaching the threshing floor, she did everything according to her mother-in-law's instructions, waiting for the right moment to approach Boaz. The symbolism of asking the Redeemer for protection was not only about material security, but also about the restoration of hope, dignity, and the continuity of the family line. She was willing to follow Naomi's guidance, demonstrating not only her faithfulness to her, but also her faith in God's promises, even in such an uncertain and difficult situation. This moment marks a pivotal point in Ruth's story, as her courage and obedience bring to light the central question of redemption. What seemed like a simple act of faithfulness between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law was actually revealing a broader divine plan. God was using the story of pain and loss to bring a solution that would transcend generations and reach the royal line of David, ensuring that the Messiah would come from the same line. With every step Ruth took, she was unknowingly fulfilling an important role in God's plan of restoration for Israel and all humanity. That night, the meeting between Ruth and Boaz was a moment of tension and anticipation. Boaz, upon waking and noticing Ruth's presence, was surprised but also extremely respectful. He immediately understood what was being asked. Ruth wanted him to be the Goel, the redeemer of Elimelech's family. This was a significant request, not only because it involved marriage, but because it carried the weight of responsibility to redeem the inheritance of a deceased relative. Ruth was boldly and respectfully placing her life in Boaz's hands, expecting him to fulfill the role that Israelite law granted him as a close relative. Boaz, touched by Ruth's sincerity and courage, responded with generosity and honor. He commended her decision to come to him, demonstrating great maturity and consideration. However, Boaz also pointed out that there was an even closer relative who had the legal right to serve as the redeemer before him. It was a delicate situation, as Boaz wanted to marry Ruth, but first needed to resolve the legal issue. The fact that Boaz was a principled person demonstrates his deep commitment to justice and the customs of Israel. He knew that for the plan of redemption to be fulfilled correctly, he must follow all the necessary steps, even if it meant waiting a little longer. The agreement between Boaz and Ruth, then, was not merely a formality, but a reflection of Boaz's faithfulness to what was just and right. He was willing to negotiate with his closest relative, seeking to ensure that Elimelech's inheritance would be redeemed without anyone being harmed or left out of the process. When Boaz met his relative at the city gate, he acted wisely. The relative initially expressed interest in redeeming Elimelech's land, but when Boaz revealed that this would also involve marrying Ruth, he backed down. This detail reveals how the desire for justice can often be challenged by one's own self-interest, but also how true redemption requires sacrifice and commitment. Faced with the refusal of his closest relative, Boaz became Ruth's legal redeemer, and what seemed like a simple land transaction became a decisive moment in Israel's history. What was at stake was not just the land, but the continuation of Elimelech's lineage and, more profoundly, the fulfillment of God's plan of redemption. Boaz's action, becoming Ruth's Goel, was an expression of generosity, honor, and loyalty. He not only restored Naomi and Ruth's inheritance, but also paved the way for the establishment of David's lineage, pointing to the Messiah who would come later. With the closest relative refusing the responsibility of redeeming Elimelech's inheritance, Boaz was given a clear path to fulfill Goel's role. He purchased a land that belonged to Elimelech, restoring it to Naomi's family, and also committed to marrying Ruth. This marriage was not just a legal formality, but a true covenant of faith and fidelity, uniting two hearts and at the same time, fulfilling God's plan of restoration. Boaz not only redeemed the land, but by marrying Ruth, he gave her a new identity, a new future, and the hope of a prosperous lineage. This marriage signified not only the union of two people, but the rebirth of a family, a heritage, and, most importantly, a story of faith that would be remembered for generations. The blessing that followed Boaz and Ruth's marriage was equally significant. God granted them a son, Obed, who would become the grandfather of King David. This detail cannot be underestimated, for Obed's birth brought to fruition the promise that David's lineage would be preserved. The story of Ruth and Boaz is not just a story of personal redemption, but of a broader divine movement that spans the entire history of Israel and culminates in the arrival of the Messiah. The restoration of Ruth and Naomi, who began as widows and hopeless foreigners, was now connected to the royal lineage of David, which, in turn, was linked to the birth of Jesus, the Savior. This act of faithfulness by both Boaz and Ruth teaches us the value of obedience to the divine plan, even when the path seems difficult or uncertain. Through them, we learn that, even in the most challenging situations, God never abandons his children. He can use even the most unlikely circumstances to bring restoration, redemption, and unexpected blessings. The story of Ruth, Boaz, and Naomi is a powerful reminder that faithfulness to God and others is never in vain. On the contrary, it can bear fruit that transcends generations, impacting not only the present but also the future of all involved. Thus, the marriage of Boaz and Ruth is not the end of the story, but the starting point for something much greater than they could have imagined. They were God's instruments in a plan of restoration and redemption, and their story lives on, reminding us that faithfulness, sacrifice, and loyalty never cease to bear fruit of blessing. And ultimately, their story invites us to look at our own lives and reflect in what areas do we need to be faithful, obedient, and willing to sacrifice so the divine plan be fulfilled. The story of Ruth and Boaz is a powerful lesson about the impact of faithfulness, not only on human relationships, but also on our walk with God. Ruth's loyalty to Naomi was not merely a display of affection or compassion. It was an action that reflected her faith in God and her willingness to follow an unknown path, unsure what the future held. Her decision to remain with Naomi and adopt the customs of Israel was ultimately a total surrender to God's plan. Ruth was not simply seeking a new lease on life. She was placing her destiny in God's hands, and her faithfulness became the key to her family's redemption. Boaz, in turn, exemplifies the role of the Goel, the family's redeemer, and his actions go far beyond simply reinstating property. He not only purchased a land, but also redeemed the lives of Naomi and Ruth, restoring their dignity and honor while preserving the lineage of Elimelech. His actions reflected an increasingly rare virtue, the willingness to put the needs of others above one's own interests. Boaz's sacrifice and commitment, even knowing the hardships and the costs involved, is a model of Christian character, pointing directly to the example of Christ, our true Redeemer. However, the true lesson of Ruth's story isn't just about faithfulness or sacrifice. It's also about hope and restoration. Amidst tragedy and loss, Ruth found not only a new beginning, but also the chance to be part of a greater plan. Through her courage and faith, she was restored to a place of honor and importance, becoming an ancestor of David and by extension of Jesus. This reminds us that even when we're at our lowest or when all seems lost, God always has a plan for restoration. The story of Ruth and Boaz teaches us that hope is never in vain. When we align ourselves with God's plan, He can transform the greatest tragedies into victories and the darkest moments into stories of light and redemption. Ruth not only teaches us about faithfulness and redemption, but also about the power of a life lived in obedience to God. Her story challenges us to look at the difficult situations we face and realize that often God is inviting us to participate in a greater plan. True redemption happens when we choose in faith to follow the path He has for us, even without knowing exactly how the future will unfold. Through Ruth's story, we are reminded that, like her, we can be part of something greater, divine plan that goes beyond our expectations. The story of Ruth and Boaz is not just about a woman who found redemption, but about how God used His moment of pain and loss to lead us to a greater purpose. Her faithfulness, loyalty, and courage in the face of adversity brought not only the restoration of her own life, but also the transformation of an entire lineage that would point to the Savior. What about you? Are you willing to believe that even in the most difficult moments, God may be preparing something extraordinary for your life? Ruth's story challenges us to trust in God's plan, to be faithful in our relationships, and act courageously, even when we can't see the path ahead. If you feel uncertain or challenged, remember restoration begins with a simple step of faith. Are you ready to take that step? If you want to delve even deeper into the lessons of faithfulness and redemption that Ruth's story teaches us, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss upcoming content that will inspire you to live a life of purpose and hope.